King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said it is Elijah, and others said it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When Herod heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to John. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter, Herodias, came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he solemnly swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She replied, the head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for his guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and then the girl gave it to her mother. When the disciples heard about it, they came and took his body, and they laid it in a tomb. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of my favorite quotes from Episcopal South African Bishop Desmond Tutu said that whenever people say that our faith, the Bible, Christianity, and politics have nothing to do with one another, he said, and I'm misquoting slightly, I wonder what Bible they're reading. Sometimes it's abundantly evident, and other times we have to look more deeply. Today is one of those days where we are confronted with a rather political piece of Mark's gospel. Center stage is King Herod. And I actually went through, because I was curious, and counted the number of times his name showed up in that passage, and the number of times that John the Baptist's name showed up. Because so often we talk more about John the Baptist and treat Herod like he's window dressing on the journey of faith. Turns out they're mentioned exactly the same number of times. I don't think that's an accident. In fact, I think we have to put King Herod center, at least for a while, to understand what was going on. So let me start by saying this. King Herod was never actually a king. Rome never gave him that title. He begged, pleaded. He wanted to be a king because Herod was the son of a king. Another king that we know, King Herod. But he was referred to not only as king, but Herod the Great. That was his father. That was the Herod who was willing to sacrifice children to consolidate power. In fact, he was willing to kill off children so that he would not have a threat to his throne, and we know that he was willing to kill his own children so that he would maintain. That is what greatness looks like in Herod's day. The truth of the matter is the permanent separation of children from their parents matters little when there is power at stake. But this Herod we're talking about today is a shadow of his father's greatness. This Herod was not great, and he was not a king. he wanted to be so badly that he was willing to behead one of the great saints of our faith. And because of that, we should get to know him a little bit better. What we know about him is that after his father's death, he and his brothers fought over what had been Herod's the Great's kingdom. And by the time it was over, Rome got fed up and split his kingdom into three. And it turns out that this Herod ended up with the Galilee region, which means he lost out completely. But he wanted so badly to be great. Being crowned king of the Galilee region, I suppose, is like being crowned king of your neighborhood. It might make you feel important when you walk down the street, but when you leave your neighborhood, nobody knows who you are. But despite this, Herod continued to petition Rome repeatedly, "Make me a king." And he made himself such a nuisance that Rome finally responded by exiling him to Gaul. He was not great. He was not a king, and his legacy is the death of John the Baptist. But this was not before his exile. He killed John. And it all begins in a strange way, because we just heard about the stories of disciples going out and taking care of others, and proclaiming, relying on the hospitality of others, and offering liberation. And they come back and they tell Jesus all about it, and lo and behold, boom, we have this interruption, and Herod shows up right in the middle, and what we have is a flashback to the death of John. Herod hears of it. Though the text says Jesus, I think it's more than just Jesus. It's not just the work of Jesus, it's the work of the disciples. All of it. The people are talking, the people are interested. Historians have said that the killing of John the Baptist did in fact happen, but maybe not quite like we're reading today. It doesn't really matter, because we know that Herod knew that John the Baptist was organizing people. That people were following John, that John was challenging corruption on all levels of government and faith and in people's lives, and people heard a word of renewal and wanted to follow him, and Herod could not handle the rival, so he killed him off. So when Mark tells us this story and refers to him as king repeatedly, you have to know that Mark is making fun of him by calling him the king he never was, but always wanted to be. So it's a cautionary tale for the disciples to recognize that we will live in times of difficulty with the Herods around us. So it all begins when Herod hears it. And anything that gets the people in an uproar will gain the attention of politicians, especially those who lead from a place of fear. And when Herod hears of it, he believes that John the Baptist has come back from the dead. This is fascinating. Why? Because the very first time in the Gospel of Mark that resurrection comes up is out of the mouth of King Herod. Herod knows. He knows better, and yet did not do better. John the Baptist must haunt him in his dreams. But in his fear, he cannot imagine that something new might be happening. All he can see are the mistakes of his past. And what a mistake it was, Mark tells us. His birthday. The party was grand. Wine, women being objectified, and lavish food. Now, what we know in the ancient world, that throwing a feast was always about impressing others. You wanted others to come to your feast so they would go, "Oh, you are great." And so Herod needed people to believe that he was important. Herod needed people to believe that he was powerful and smart and special. And so he spared no expense on this birthday. And at the height of the meal, while all of his guests are being entertained by his daughter, he decides to reward her. Knowing full well she actually can't own property anyway, so anything he gives her isn't hers to begin with. And in his arrogance, in his drunken stupor, in his sense of delusion of power. He wants to show not anything for her. He doesn't care. What he wants to show is how powerful he is. And so in front of his guests, blinded by his arrogance, he offers her anything she wants, up to half of my kingdom. And this is the moment that Herodias had been waiting for. We have to talk about her for a moment. Because John the Baptist had been preaching against her marriage to Herod. Why? Well, what we know is she never divorced her previous husband. She's still married to Philip, but now she's living with this king-ish and married to him, and that means that marriage is precarious. We also know that Herod was fascinated with John. So he clearly had something going on and was listening to what was happening. And so because Jewish law forbade this marriage, and Herod was fascinated with the teaching, as long as he was around, there was the risk that Herod was going to change his mind. And that would then lead her and her daughter out on the streets to fend for themselves. Probably never thought about it that way. She was doing what she believed was necessary to save her own neck and the neck of her daughter. We already know that Herod was a bit of a monster. So before you look down on her actions, before you look down on her at all, know that she was doing what she believed would help keep she, and more importantly, her daughter, safe. What's the death of one peasant prophet? And with a tyrant like Herod, we have to be careful to blame her for Herod's death, for John the Baptist's death. Because at the end of the day, the king-ish is responsible. But he works very carefully to put it at his wife's feet. His head on a platter. This is a very specific request. And now, in this moment, King Herod believes he has a problem. He is and wants to be a real king, but he's not. Instead, he's a king who is driven by his fragile ego. A real king would have said, that's ridiculous. The waves, get out. But instead, he feels like he needs to impress his guests. He's worried about their attitudes. So he's going to cut somebody's head off? So here we have this arrogant king-ish who lacks self-confidence and yet overcompensates at the same time, and he leads him to act like there was nothing he could do. You see how that works? This is just the Bible. If you're making connections, that's on you. And then when it's all over, what does he do? He places the blame back on his wife and his daughter, who have little power in this situation. So the result of his fragile ego and overinflated sense of power leads to John's death. And here's what's interesting. The only food ever mentioned at the banquet turns out to be John's head on a platter. This is clearly a cautionary tale for the disciples, because it is sandwiched in between them coming back from their mission and ministry, and on the other side, defeating. We'll get there in a few weeks. The whole section here was about the mission and ministry of the disciples. So while it is about Herod, it is also a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that the danger exists in Herods. When we run into the Herods of the world who are egotistical, who see women as playthings, or believe they are more powerful than they are, or lacking any sense of humility, we should be cautious. But this passage is more than just a cautionary tale. While it is about the Herod in this story, the less than great, not King Herod, and the Herods who exist throughout the ages, it is something more. This passage is more than just going home and saying, oh, I can see King Herod around in our own time. Because I think in truth, the passage really begins and ends with the disciples. It begins with the disciples reporting back to Jesus all they had done, and it ends with the disciples of John coming to get his body. It sounds like a throwaway line, but it is not. Herod doesn't get the last word. He might have killed John, but the disciples come and offer a funeral. They bury his body. And I believe that is what gives us a clue on how we might then act when the Herods of our world run amok. With their teacher dead, the disciples of John have a decision to make. They're not required to go get his body. If their teacher has been killed, how much more could they be killed? They have to make a decision on what needs to be done now. What do we do now that our leader is dead? Many of them ended up following Jesus. And what they're asking of themselves is a practical issue. John has to be buried, or are we going to leave him to rot on a pile somewhere of Herod's dead people? Herod can do whatever he wants. They can't stop him. Herod can be the tyrant he hopes to be, but his disciples, in their actions, in deciding to go get the body, are refusing to choose despair. Despair would have led them to run away. What's the point? All we've done is now over. What if they believed Herod had the last word? But they didn't. And now we have a witness for a different way of acting. This witness reminds us, I believe, that politicians' actions only have so much power. And we need to stop giving them more power by falling into despair. We need to refuse to do their work for them, because we have been called to act as people of hope, not of optimism. That you will not get the last word, and you will not change me, for I will follow the God who is rooted and is the source of love. Taking time to bury John is an act of love and defiance in the face of arrogance. It seems like a simple act, and it is, but it is powerful. It turns out, in the face of Herod's, we're called to do what we're always called to do. To proclaim liberation and transformation. To offer love. To bury. To baptize. To marry. To refuse the ways of hate. To stand up when we are able. And sometimes it might just be very practical things. Do not become paralyzed by the Herods of our day. Here's what I think the writer of Mark is trying to tell us. Do not be deterred. Keep going. And here's the other thing. Herods will come and go. And in the end, faith will lead us. Let us never help them by refusing to do what we've been called to do in our own lives. Find something. Find some way. Some act rooted in love, and then remember it is an act of resistance. Find something to do. Following Jesus isn't just here. It is rooted in our hands and feet. Do something. Something that's rooted in love, no matter how small, and you are part of building the beloved community. Do something and know that whatever it is you choose to do, when rooted in love, is a loving act, a symbol of hope, and a sign of defiance in a world God